much. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So up next, we have Reagan.
Okay, just give me a second to share my screen. Desktop. Okay. Okay, speaking of trauma, I have a very similar topic. So, all right. So my name is Reagan, and I am an artist and mental health advocate and a future art educator. And I've kind of noticed that trauma affects so many aspects about our lives, but how about our art? Like, how does it affect our art? So today I'm kind of going to go through my historical and autoethnographic research to answer the question, does trauma subconsciously impact art style? So here's what I'm going to go over, but I also wanted to give a trigger warning for this because I'm going to bring up some topics about trauma relating to sexual assault, self-harm, suicide, and depression. And if you're not comfortable with that, it's okay if you want to leave the Zoom and pop back in 9 minutes. So here are a lot of the terms I will be using. I just wanted to note that in my research, trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And I just want to note that I will be using style and aesthetic interchangeably. So for the first half of my research, I did a lot of historical research, and I chose 3 artists from history for that. The first is Artemisia Gentileschi, and I chose her because at this time in art history, the majority of paintings were commissions of typically biblical narratives, and I wanted to see if and how trauma can affect aesthetics with restricted subjects. So I would love to go through my deep analysis of each of these paintings, but we don't have time for that today. So I just hope that y'all keep in mind the subject matter, tone, color, expressions, and saturation, and your emotional response as a viewer as we go through these. So this is a painting from before her traumatic experience called The Madonna and Child. And as you can see, it's kind of very warm and nice and sweet. But in 1611, a friend of her father and another man had raped her, and her art afterwards is quite different. So this piece is Judith slaying Holofernes. This one is Judith and her maidservant. And this one is Susanna and the Elders. And this one is particularly notable because before this time, Susanna had been portrayed as a seductress. But as you can see, Gentileschi kind of took a 180 with her art and made things a lot more dark and graphic and just took a new approach to things. So the next artist I want to talk about is Francisco Goya, who was a Spanish romantic painter and printmaker who was an important artist in the 19th century, and he typically painted historical events, figures, and portraits. So what had happened to him in 1972 is that he developed this neurological illness that led to vertigo, ataxia, vision changes, and he was left half deaf. So we're going to look at some of his art before and after that experience. So here's one from before called The Work, and here's one from after. And as I said, keep in mind subject matter, tone, color, expression, saturation, and how you respond to these as a viewer. And here's a second one called Truth, Time, and History compared to Triple Generation. And as you can see, they're very similar subjects, but also vividly different in the way they are depicted. And the last artist I want to talk about is Pablo Picasso, who was a Spanish painter, sculptor, and printmaker who spent most of his adult life in France and was the co-founder of Cubism. And if you know I picked Picasso, you know it's probably because of the Blue Period. Now, during the Blue Period, what had happened was his best friend had killed himself, and after that, Picasso sank into a severe depression, and that led to a very visible change in his art. So first we have A Seated Woman from 1900, and then compared to a piece from the Blue Period, which was 1901 to 1904, where it's the same subject matter, but depicted in a very different way. And it's the same with these next two from before the Blue Period and during the Blue Period. So this is more personal art rather than commissioned art. And with personal art, there is more room for expression. And that's the kind of art that I do, which leads into the second half of my research, which is autoethnographic research. And that's the kind of research where an author will use self-reflection to explore anecdotal and personal experience to connect it to a wider study. And I decided to take this approach because I have more insight on my own thoughts and experiences than I do on any artists of the past. And also, I didn't really get any volunteers to share their experiences in art with me from modern. So what I learned, I took a step back and analyzed my art through the past decade of my life And upon reflection, I discovered that my art has 3 distinguishable periods that directly correlate to traumas in my life, and I've kind of named them in the way that Picasso named the blue period. So the first period is the pastel period. And at this part, I was a young adult who was recently out of an abusive relationship and was healing from it. And this was marked by an abundance of whites and pastel colors, and the subjects were people I knew, like my mother and sister, and the tones were overall content and bright. The second period I've named the gray period. This was when I was deep into a depression and was self-harming and ended up in a mental hospital. And during this point, I avoided color a lot, and I'm not sure why. I just didn't really feel the need for it anymore because my life had become so colorless. And if you look at the bottom right, there's this one face that kept reoccurring in all of my art because none of my subjects had identities anymore. Because I didn't feel like I had an identity. I had just become what my depression was, so nothing needed to be individualized. And the last period I have named the vivid period. This period was directly after my last traumatic experience, where I was raped and I used drugs and alcohol to cope. And the art that came out at that time was very saturated and vivid. Like there were no blank spaces, and these works were probably the largest works, like larger than anything I had ever done before. And if I were to like think about it, I think that the color and size change were my attempt to be loud, to be heard, to kind of scream through canvas. And I began representing myself as a subject clearly in all my paintings, rather than using faceless people or other people. So it seems that there was a need to be heard and known as I dealt with this trauma. And all of these changes were subconscious. I did not set out with the goal of changing my art. There was just this impulsive need to communicate in these ways. At times, it was like I would explode if I didn't get this thing out of my brain and onto the canvas in front of me. And I hadn't even realized there were such extreme changes in my art aesthetic until I went through and looked at it. So the question, does trauma impact aesthetic? And the answer is yes. Trauma is part of the motivation behind art. Artists don't go out seeking change. There's no intentionality. It's just a subconscious need to communicate and express something that has been deeply affecting them. And communicating it through art is an attempt to heal by the subconscious mind. Now, what do we do with this information? As art educators, we have the tendency to encourage the use of emotion in art for our students, but we don't use examples. We teach children to use emotion to motivate their own paintings and works, but we don't actually teach how emotion was used in the art that we study. Understanding how trauma impacts aesthetics makes students more aware of choices in an artist's work and in their own. The emotion behind the input of a piece is just as important as the output. And in art history, we tend to focus more on the what, the product, than the why. But the artist and their experience is just as important as the physical art. Knowing what the artist was going through or dealing with at when a certain work was made makes the artist more relatable and acceptable to students. Gathering the biographical parts of someone's life is important, but it's only half the study. What were they thinking? What were they feeling? What made their art change? Like, yes, their art is like very aesthetically pleasing, but why was there a change? Why did the subject or the color or the tone or the emotion of their pieces change overall? Like all of the artworks and artists that I have memorized, I actually do know nothing about the motivation behind their works. It's just, here's the artist, here's the date, memorize it, you study art history now. And the last application would be personal. Maybe like me, this question will encourage you to start looking for changes in your own art and seeing if you've been trying to communicate and deal with something subconsciously. At the end of the day, if something needs to be said, it will be said. And there's a therapeutic effect to that kind of communication. Talking about things can really help, but when the words won't come and they can't be spoken and you can't feel that you are understood and the things in your head like stay left unsaid, then art is needed for that communication and expression. And it is expression from the subconscious that may show up as significant aesthetic changes caused by trauma. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reagan. That I just, I think putting like, I've never thought to look at my own artwork or even ask anyone else to do it. So like look at it, chronologically like that and put it in like, I love how you were examining your artwork through visual content, right? And then understanding that, like, then putting the context behind it. And so, that idea of even looking at the what versus the why, I think y'all are going to hear me say that again. So thank